Howdy howdy. Let's discuss the most common myths about autism. In fact, let's debunk them. I'll share some of my own experience as someone on the spectrum, and I've taken feedback from my channel's community, as they're over 50% autistic. We'll fact check through Professor Tony Atwood, who's one of the world's leading experts on autism spectrum. He actually diagnosed me back when I was 10 years old. We'll also hear from my mum, who's been a specialist teacher for AS children for over 40 years.
Hello, nice to meet you.
Hi Mum. Oh, we'll also hear from Dr. Michelle Garnett, who has an additional 30 years of clinical experience. We'll also hear from my wife Nin, because, she's Nin.
Yeah, trust me, I'm Nin.
Anyway, let's debunk the biggest autism myths. Just a warning ahead though, some of these myths are incredibly stupid and probably seem very obvious to you. But sadly, many people in my community have heard these myths before, so we'll debunk them together. Our first myth is, autism is a disease. Nope, so wrong. Autism is not something to be quote-unquote cured in children. It's myth. Philly myth. In the last decade or so, doctors and people on the spectrum have tried to explain how damaging this myth is. Unfortunately, some bad organizations do further spread this myth, such as Autism Speaks. Rather than focusing on promoting understanding, they focus instead on promoting fear, stigma, and prejudice towards autistic people. In reality, someone on the spectrum has a different wiring of the brain that they're born with. This is where the term neurodivergent comes from, as in neurologically divergent. Dr. Michelle Garnett debunked this one in one sentence.
Autism is who you are.
And it lasts as long as you do.
Yeah!
Obviously, this also debunks the myth that autism is something you grow out of. Originally, I hadn't added this myth, but one of my patrons mentioned they were told growing up that they would grow out of it, so I wanted to address this. Rather than the person growing to understand the strengths and weaknesses of who they are is treated as a childhood phase they'll grow out of, and that's a horrible myth to be told. The CDC estimates about 5.4 million adults in the USA are on the autism spectrum, and 89% of my community is over 18, so no, obviously autism is not exclusive to children. But although autism obviously isn't a disease, the challenges of being on the spectrum can lead to very real mental challenges. Some autistic people can have challenges in what's called sensory processing, which can make loud noises, bright lights, and a simple shopping center experience an exhausting experience. For example, I have to cover my ears when I hear a loud noise like a siren or a motorbike, as it feels like a jackhammer to my brain. This and other daily social and emotional challenges can lead to issues like anxiety, withdrawal from society, and even depression. And for some, these daily challenges of the autism spectrum can lead to job difficulties too. For example, in my country, the ABS found that only 40% of autistic people were actually employed. And in America, the statistics made my jaw drop. Forbes found that only 32% of adults with autism were employed, compared to over 70% of neurotypical adults. Speaking as someone who spent nearly 20 years trying different jobs, I've always really connected with this employment challenge. But I say don't give up, because I eventually found a lot of jobs I enjoyed, such as repairing computers, or doing the night shift at the service station, or being a support worker. So no, autism isn't a disease, but it certainly does have challenges that people should be offered support for, regardless of how young or old they are. Our next myth is, autistic people are all brilliant or have a super skill. This myth is a good example of how a positive stereotype can actually be quite damaging. One problem with this myth is it actually creates a strong social pressure on autistic people. If they hear this myth and they struggle in school, it might make them feel stupid or like they're not trying hard enough. Parents, students, or other teachers might assume they'll be geniuses and know everything. Personally, I stunk at math. I hope you weren't, but I was awful at it.
Oh, for goodness sake, Josh, it's maths. Americans say math.
But Mom, I'm mostly talking to Americans. That's what they recognize.
Fine. but your grammar brings out the teacher in me.
Regardless, this myth can hurt autistic people's self-esteem, and they can crumble under the pressure it places on them. While there are certainly many smart people on the spectrum like Stephen Hawking or Albert Einstein, or very talented actors like Jim Carrey, Stephen Fry, Robin Williams, or Dan Aykroyd, these people are well known because they stand out as very smart or talented, and because they happen to be able to become famous from these smarts. But just like neurotypical people, these super intelligent or super talented autistic people are generally among a 1% to maybe 0.1% of people. And you know what? That's okay. You're allowed to just be you. You don't have to be super brilliant, and you don't have to be talented. I think this myth occurred because people on the spectrum can tend to focus on a small selection of interests. And as a result of this hyper-focus, they can get very skilled at these hobbies.
These special skills are called splinter skills because they're a specific area of skill rather than the person being super intelligent.
Not related to Splinter from Ninja Turtles?
No, Josh, not the Ninja Turtles.
But Splinter taught them every skill they need. One of my own Splinter skills is juggling. I love to juggle, and I've juggled since I was 15. But I still occasionally drop the balls. My point is you don't have to be incredible. You can just be you. Do you. And our next myth is autistic people aren't interested in relationships? Utter crap. Hey, honey.
Hey, how you doing?
Maybe some people on the spectrum aren't interested in relationships, but many on the spectrum are. This guy included. I was online dating for like 15 years before I finally met the right person. This lovely lady.
We both met on a Facebook group for singles.
Interest in social relationships comes down to personality, not autism. Many autistic people like me deeply value social connections.
When Tony diagnosed you, he asked you whether you were interested in social relationships. After he asked, you and I both laughed.
Oh yeah, I still remember that. I suspect this myth developed because people on the spectrum can like to put themselves in solitude when tired from interactions. This gives us a chance to recover our energy. Like, even though I really enjoy my solitude, I still like to see Nin every day. Ever since I was a teenager, I've always wanted a relationship. But I had a hard time just keeping friends, yet alone a romantic relationship. I think Dr. Garnett had a good way of putting it.
Even if you're an introverted autistic person, you're likely still interested in some social relationships because we all need connection.
Hell yeah, Doc. Our next myth is people on the spectrum don't feel empathy? Oh, this one is so wrong it hurts. Most people on the spectrum absolutely have empathy, just like any neurotypical person. What is much more true is people on the spectrum can't always express that empathy in ways that neurotypical people are used to. But people on the spectrum absolutely can feel pain and can feel emotions. Sometimes even more deeply than neurotypical people. Speaking as myself, yes, a million times I feel emotion and pain. According to Professor Atwood and Dr. Michelle's studies, autistic people can struggle with what's known as theory of mind. Theory of mind is basically knowing how people feel by their faces, their tone of voice, and body language. And yeah, sometimes I just can't figure out how someone's feeling from their face. And I often have to use my gut feeling to figure it out. All this aside, the idea that people on the spectrum don't feel empathy is a very damaging myth. In fact, Dr. Michelle pointed out that autistic people can be more sensitive to their friends' emotions than neurotypicals. For example, I tend to pick up really quickly if Nin is feeling upset or angry in a situation, and I'll always quickly try and help and remove her from that situation. Some autistic people can also find that other people's anxiety can be contagious and make them feel anxious. It's almost a cliche to say nowadays, but what a person looks like on the outside isn't always how they're feeling on the inside. My mum has seen a lot of this intense emotions on the inside in both autistic children and adults.
On the outside, a person on the autism spectrum might feel distant or indifferent because they're processing emotions internally, but they still feel those emotions and pain. We just don't see it from the outside.
Oh, hi again, Mum.
Aw, hi Josh.
I think this myth has been exacerbated by characters like Sheldon on The Big Bang Theory. He's one of the most annoying representations of people on the spectrum that I know, but sadly, also one of the most popular. He tends to show no empathy for others and no interest in other human beings. That's not an autistic person. That's a psychopath.
Bazinga!
Fortunately, there is a lot of better representations nowadays in both animation and TV. Even Fred from Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated is on the spectrum, and there have been moments the crew has helped him through a meltdown. Scooby can be like his support animal at times. It's really beautiful. And one final point to put a stake in this stupid autistic people don't feel empathy myth. This is what Tony and Michelle said after a combined 80 years of meeting people on the autism spectrum.
Some of the most kind and compassionate people we've ever met are on the spectrum. They can often build very deep friendships and go the extra mile to be there for their friends.
Our next myth is autism is rare. This one really depends on what you call rare and what level of autism we're talking about. In the USA, the CDC found that over 2% of the population are on the spectrum. To be clear, this doesn't mean that there is a sudden increase in autistic people. So no, there is no autism epidemic. We're not even going to bother with that myth. Autism has become less rare over time because medical professionals are now diagnosing more people, especially women. And even with this 2%, this doesn't account for the many people undiagnosed. But my point is that you shouldn't have to feel unusual if you're on the spectrum. 50 to 60% of my community is on the spectrum. About 80% of my Discord community is. I'm on the spectrum, my brother's on the spectrum, my uncle's on the spectrum, and my mum is too.
Yeah, don't forget your grandfather was too.
Oh yeah, and we suspect Nin is on the spectrum as well.
Yeah, but like a lot of women in the 90s, I was not diagnosed.
But it's worth mentioning that there are 3 levels of autism, and level 2 and 3 are much rarer than level 1. And this actually ties into our next myth. Autism looks the same in every person. Autism can look dramatically different in each person. That's why it's called the autism spectrum.
Do you want a hand explaining the 3 levels of autism?
Yeah, thanks Mum, that'd be really helpful.
One way to think of the levels is how much support and difficulties they have. Someone with level 1 will always have some AS traits like difficulties coping in social situations and sensory processing issues. But with a bit of support, they're going to be able to live a very similar life to a neurotypical person.
Level 1 is most common and it's what I am, and it's what many people in my community are. But we certainly have some level 2s and 3s, and of course they're always welcome. Level 1 autism may include difficulties with talking to others, inflexible behavior, sensory sensitivities, difficulties with employment, and difficulties making friends. A good cartoon example of level 1 is SpongeBob. He meticulously follows his habits of the Krusty Krab. He can have difficulties fitting in with the crowd. He can have a lot of emotional difficulties at times, but other times he can be perfectly okay. In case you didn't know, Tom Kenny confirmed SpongeBob was autistic in an interview.
Level 2 is more rare. It means requiring a lot of support in most areas of their lives. Things like supported employment, difficulties with emotional regulation, and ongoing issues with social interactions and relationships.
I tried to find an example of level 2 in cartoons, but there's tons of level 1s, but not many level 2s. But I could find a TV show example in Attorney Woo from the Netflix show. Really wish the actor was actually on the spectrum, but she does a really good job with level 2 as a neurotypical actor. Again, I realize there's a ton of autism spectrum examples like Tina Belcher or Mandy, but the vast majority are level 1.
Level 3 is the most rare. It means needing near constant support to communicate and manage sensory input.
Level 3 often has difficulties such as limited speech, extremely inflexible behavior, and approaching others only to get needs met. An example of level 3 is Renee from Pixar's short film Loop. She's completely non-verbal and struggles heavily with sensory issues, to the point where it's quite a challenge for her to go with another person in a boat. It's quite hard to find examples of level 3 autism in animation. I think this is partially because the people on level 3 autism don't communicate in a typical verbal, neurotypical manner. Julia from Sesame Street is potentially level 3 as she's also non-verbal. This one's debatable as Julia's only 4 years old, and I was almost non-verbal at that age too. Basically, the 3 levels are there to indicate the level of support needed for that person. Though Tony did have some issues with putting autism into these 3 levels.
When we put autism into linear categories, it implies mild, moderate, and severe autism. All autism can be challenging, and these categories can minimize the distress if someone is a lower level of autism than 3. It's helpful to know a person's level of autism, but we should also know that whole person and their goals, priorities, and individual strengths.
See, this is a big part of why I kept putting off making this video. Each person's experience of autism can be so different. Like, for example, I can't stand loud music, but I had an autistic friend who loved loud music. She'd pump up the music to the max in the car and it drove me insane. So we need to make sure we look at the individual person, not just categorize them into one level of autism. Our next myth is autism is caused by bad parenting. Hang on, I thought the myth was that autism was a quote-unquote disease. Now it's a disease caused by bad parenting? How does that even work? Tony suggested to me that I debunk this myth as sadly he's heard it from a lot of parents over the years. And it seems to get him quite passionate. How'd you describe this myth, Chief?
Utter rot. It's so wrong, it's laughable. I can only laugh at it. However, believing this myth is no laughing matter at all.
And yeah, it's cause for concern for people who actually believe this myth. Although it's absolutely true that varying parental styles can affect mental health, it cannot create different neurological wiring like autism. Dr. Garnett had some closing thoughts on this.
It's tragic to hear some parents think this. We now know that being autistic is due to having a different neurology, and that autism brings strengths as well as challenges.
Let's put a pin in it. Autism is present from birth. It's not created by lifestyle choices and not any external influences. The next myths are autistic people are aggressive and meltdowns are just temper tantrums. I've combined these myths together because they both discuss meltdowns. Don't get me wrong, they're both wrong, obviously, but the aggressive one particularly is really weird to me. I guess I find it odd because I was never a particularly aggressive child, but I did have occasional meltdowns.
You never had too many growing up, but I have seen thousands of meltdowns and shutdowns over the decades in schools.
In my own case, I'd run out of school to hide in a toilet cubicle and shout out my frustrations. Childhood isn't always a pleasant experience for people on the spectrum, or anyone really.
Sometimes it can be shit.
Yes, well, would you mind describing a meltdown, love?
Sure! A meltdown is heightened sensory and emotional reactivity, leading to a loss of control and intense distress.
Right, they're not a temper tantrum, they're different, that's silly. A lot of us are grown adults, why would we have a temper tantrum? No, it's just crazy. Shutdowns and meltdowns are the way these overwhelming experiences can manifest. Meltdowns can reflect those internal struggles sometimes faced by people on the spectrum.
It's a sign they're overwhelmed and overstimulated.
For me, that overstimulation feels like being hit on the head and really upset. All those upset feelings can well up at once. When I hear a motorbike or a loud siren, I often define it as a jackhammer to my brain. But in society to look neurotypical, we traditionally have to get those overwhelming feelings in check very fast. But I think these myths formed because these meltdowns look like aggression to some people. Sometimes an autistic person's anxiety can appear as anger or non-violent aggression, according to our friend Tony.
Angry behavior may be an indication of uncontrollable anxiety that is a result of being on the spectrum.
Regardless of this myth, people on the spectrum aren't any more likely to be aggressive than neurotypical people. However, we are more likely to have meltdowns due to sensory overload.
This is true. An autistic person is dealing with more input in a day without the ability to filter out what's not helpful or important.
There can be emotional management difficulties too. Sometimes we can reach our sensory limits in a day quicker and need to escape. Some other people on the spectrum might freeze up, unable to act due to overwhelming emotions. We're not necessarily more aggressive, sometimes we're just struggling. Whether a person's neurodivergent or neurotypical, there's always going to be aggressive people out there. But being on the spectrum makes no difference to that. You're no more likely to be aggressive. Here's a little advice from Tony for people who are dealing with meltdowns.
Rather than punishing these behaviours, it's often better to acknowledge the emotional challenge. You can do this by saying something as simple as, "I can see that you're distressed."
This validation helps a person feel heard and understood. Plus, they can feel more like they're in a supportive and safe space. You're more likely to end a meltdown with a compassionate and informed response rather than labeling that behavior as unacceptable. That being said, Tony made another important point.
While a compassionate response is important, it's equally important to emphasise that violence or harm towards others should never be accepted or tolerated in any situation.
It's just a matter of teaching people non-harmful ways to express themselves. Maybe I could paint a picture, take a walk, do karate, or start a stupid YouTube channel of ranting about cartoons. Whatever works for you.
These days, there's a lot more strategies to manage sensory and social overload. Early intervention does help, but it's never too late to learn these strategies.
Our next myth is, non-speaking autistic people are profoundly intellectually impaired. Tony recommended I debunk this one directly, as you can probably tell from the more academic wording than this clown would use. To quote him from our chat,
A lack of speech does not mean a lack of intelligence. I believe many non-verbals can't always connect mind to body due to a movement disturbance.
movement disturbances are basically a group of neurological conditions that affect movement. I think Renee from Loop is a good example for debunking this myth. She's a non-verbal person with level 3 autism, but it's clear when we can see her perspective that she's not stupid. She's just struggling so much with everything. Constant sensory issues, communication issues, and other mind-to-body challenges. She's wired different, and that's really tough for her. But I certainly wouldn't call Renee stupid because she's non-verbal.
Let's get back on the lake.
Our next myth is, only guys can be on the autism spectrum?
Objection!
Absolutely 110% not true. In my own experience, I've known tons of women in this community alone that are on the spectrum. Unfortunately, there's been a lot less research put into women on the spectrum than men, and a lot of past popular TV shows, such as Big Bang Theory, have only represented men on the spectrum, very rarely women. To make up for this, we have characters like Julia and Sesame Street. In Sesame Street, a big reason Julia is a girl on the spectrum is Sesame Workshop wanted to demonstrate that all genders could be autistic. A big ongoing issue we've had for literal decades now is a lot of women who are on the spectrum are never diagnosed. According to Michelle and Tony, for a long time, a lot of women have been flying under the radar.
So why does autism often go so unseen in girls?
That's just been such a huge wave of knowledge in the last, I'd say even 4 to 5 years.
The reason many women have flown under the radar is partially because many autistic women are excellent at masking being autistic. For example, pretty much all the close women I have in my life are undiagnosed. For example, my mum is almost certainly on the spectrum, but was just never diagnosed.
It certainly would explain a lot.
I've often suspected our co-host Nin is on the spectrum too.
Yeah, I think so. I have a lot of autistic traits, and I relate well to other people on the spectrum. Yeah!
And our friend Dr. Michelle is also on the spectrum. She's a great example of a late diagnosis, as she wasn't diagnosed till she was 53. Though Michelle has also mentioned some more complex reasons men tend to be diagnosed more than women, and I'll briefly mention them.
The female brain is a little more connected over the corpus callosum. This can lead to a better social ability overall.
Very basically, as well as having an awesome name, the corpus callosum is the connector of both the left side and the right side of your brain. Corpus callosum. Michelle also mentioned some very real societal elements too. I imagine you can fill in the gaps. But the biggest point made is that women can be excellent at camouflaging their autistic traits. But it's important to point out that even if they're successful, this masking can be exhausting. Personally, I find women on the spectrum one of the most fascinating mysteries in society, and I always love learning more. Next, we have a very weird myth. Autistic people have the mind of a toddler? What? What the frick? I can't even say that line with conviction because it sounds so weird. I personally have been lucky enough to not hear this myth before, but I've heard from people in my community they've been affected by it, and that's horrible. Where to start? This one doesn't make any sense on any level. It even kind of conflicts with other stereotypes on the spectrum, like everyone on the spectrum is super smart. Obviously, the myth is ridiculously insulting and untrue. Have you ever met a toddler? They're really stupid. We all are at that age.
Josh, that's harsh.
But there's just no preservation instincts there. What's that? Bleach on the top cupboard? Toddlers will find a way up there to give it a swig.
Well, regarding the toddler myth, I think it comes from the belief that because AS people struggle with social communication, they can appear innocent or naive in their social responses, well, at least compared to neurotypical people.
Yeah, so like, even if autistic people appear naive, they may not actually be on the inside. The next myth is not a favourite of mine. We all have a little bit of autism. You've got to be kidding me. We've had decades of professional diagnostic criteria for assessing whether someone's on the autism spectrum or not. And even that aside, I've met people who are incredibly neurotypical and have no problems with sensory overload or social situations or emotional management whatsoever. Who comes up with this misinformation? Moving on. And finally, for one of the stupidest myths of all, and that's against some serious competition. Vaccines cause autism.
No, unacceptable.
This myth is so stupid, I just had to save it to last. No complications to this, both our doctors can confirm this. Countless empirical studies have been done debunking this over literal decades.
People don't develop autism like a case of measles. Autism is a difference in neurological wiring and it lasts as long as the person does.
Unfortunately, we're getting into such a ridiculously absurd realm of myths that I feel like I'm wasting Tony and Michelle's time, and I was kind of embarrassed to ask this one.
Sorry.
I mean, I'm sure they give me an answer and all, but I'm not asking doctors and professors this stuff. We've got Google right there. Done. I had 10 National Library of Medicine empirical studies within 8 seconds. The misinformation started in 1998 when a fraud paper was released with a sample size of 12 people. 12 people, that's it, that's what started all this. This paper speculated that the measles vaccine caused autism. The paper was officially labelled fraud almost immediately by accredited medical researchers such as England's General Medical Council, and multiple proper studies were done immediately after that disproved these speculations. And this study of 12 people from 27 years ago was funded by lawyers trying to sue vaccination companies. The paper was retracted. The researchers were found guilty of falsifying facts. It was scientific fraud in every way possible. Despite all these actual facts, the paper received huge publicity at the time. And tragically, vaccination rates dropped in children almost immediately. If we could track how many people this one paper has indirectly killed, it would be considered a genocidal maniac. In fact, we don't even need the studies to prove this myth is stupid. As you know, I'm a clown. Let's get a demonstration from other clowns. Many years ago, Penn and Teller gave the best debunking of this vaccination myth that clowns like us could do. They compared two groups, one that got the vaccination and one that didn't. Hypothetically, if vaccinations did somehow cause autism,
Which it fucking doesn't!
there would be one child out of the 110 vaccinated out of line. The other 110 unvaccinated people would have to deal with diphtheria, which had a 40% death rate, polio, which caused the death and permanent disabling of many people, including my grandmother. The unvaccinated also risked meningitis, mumps, hepatitis, whooping cough, rotavirus, rubella, chickenpox, smallpox. That alone killed 300 million people. 1 in 3, boom, dead. You can see here, even if the myth was true that vaccinations cause autism, which they don't, not vaccinating your child would still be utter
Bullshit.
And even that aside, it's an outright insult to parents and people with autism. Anyway, you get the idea. Let's finish up. And whether you're neurodivergent or neurotypical, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think of these myths? A big thanks to my mum, Tony and Michelle, but also a big thanks to you and the rest of my community, who for many years have given me a neurodiverse place where I can feel safe and at home. I never had that growing up, so I appreciate it now. Thanks for watching, and whether I see you next time or not, I'll be back. And thanks to my patron bosses and members, including these patrons and members you see here. And an extra thanks to my bosses in the patron shoutout tier. These people include Anna Jones, Autistic, Angel Angeline, 3 Cat Day, Boquifan, Skyzo, The Furry of Fury, Cookie Monster, Shockwave FPS Studios, Miss Arceus, Noah C, Fluff Paws, Jacob Snyder, Joseph Bowers, Alistor, Jordan McCann, Chandler Amethyst, Alyssa Michelle, Stealth Diamond, Megan Bruns, The Hug Wizard, Rain Graves, Saturn Yoshi, Eagle Talon, William Johnson, I Cosmic, IndieCore 2, and Joe Ferry. Thank you for keeping the lights on. I've wanted to make this video for years. And let's finish up with some Garfield and Normal comics. You don't have to play with that pathetic little ball of yarn, Normal. I'll get my personal ball of yarn for you. I'm just nice like that.
How nice! Maybe Garfield likes me after all.
Shoo.
Oh no! Don't hate me because I'm cute.
I'm getting tired of replacing that door. Try Spackle.
Cheer up, Garfield. 15's not so old for an oak tree.
Crash.
Ow! Hello, I'm Normal the
world's cutest kitten. I know. My hello, Normal. Aren't you cute? I want some attention too.
Ow!
Aw, poor little guy. Well, 2 can play the sympathy game.
Crash!
That was one of my best plates. That was one of my best heads.
Hey, quit leaning on me.
I am not leaning on you.
Blop. See?
The wind shifted, that's all. Oh, great. Just what I don't need to see.
Why?
If you must know, I'm having a birthday soon.
I thought I smelled old in here.
Where's Normal? Out getting some fresh air. How do we get out of this tree?
We jump.
If that little twerp can jump, so can I.